Hello, welcome to BibleDudes. This video is about one of my favorite topics. It's about the prophets. It's about prophets in the ancient Near East in general, but also it's meant to be an introduction to prophets in the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament. Prophets make up a large section of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, is also known as the Tanakh, because it's an acronym for the three sections that make it up. The Torah, which is the law, the first 5 books of the Bible. The next section is the Nevi'im. Nevi'im is the Hebrew word for prophets. And then the Ketuvim, the Hebrew word for the writings. So the T for Torah, N for Nevi'im, and K for Ketuvim form the consonants of the word Tanakh. The prophets section of the Hebrew Bible, the Nevi'im, is further divided into the former prophets and latter prophets. Former prophets include the books Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. It's the story of what happens to Israel after Moses, through the period of Judges until they get a monarchy, first united, then divided, and then the destruction of Judah with the Babylonian exile in 586 BCE. So that story is in the former prophets. The latter prophets is what we're going to be focused on. It includes the major prophets. There's 3 of them, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. I should point out here that they're known as the major and minor prophets because of length, not because of importance. So that's the quote-unquote prophets in terms of the section of the Hebrew Bible with the Nevi'im. So now let's see what it takes to be a prophet. And to do that, to help us understand what is a prophet, we're going to look at some of the names that people in antiquity used for prophets. Our English word prophet comes from the Greek word prophetes. It means to speak on behalf of another. The idea here is that prophets were speaking on behalf of deities, allegedly at least. It's based on the model of a royal messenger. So if I were working for someone like the Pharaoh Ramses, and he wanted me to deliver a message to a Hittite king, such as Mu'atali, I would start off by saying, "Thus says Ramses the Great, I am so very angry about what you did at the Battle of Kadesh." So notice the messenger announces who said the message. Then he switches to the first person, as if he were the king. So too prophets announce messages from God. Think about Moses telling the king of Egypt, "Thus says Yahweh, let my people go," with the my referring to Yahweh. All right, so that's the etymology of prophet in English. Hebrew word, well, there's several Hebrew words for prophet, but the most common word in Hebrew for prophet is a navi. It means one who is called. So the Greek definition of prophets is about being a messenger. And the Hebrew word navi is more about God choosing someone to carry out a task. Right? One who is called, such as a vocation. So in addition to navi, there are other terms used for prophets in the Hebrew Bible. We have ish Elohim, which means man of God. And then we have 2 words, roeh and choseh, which mean seer, with the idea being they're seeing things that other people can't. Anyone could be a prophet. Some, like Isaiah, are wealthy and politically connected with urban centers, and others, like Amos, are poor and more rural. We have female prophets in the Bible as well. So anybody from any background can become a prophet. So let's look at their tasks. Prophets predict the future. It's very valuable to be able to see what's going to happen in the future. They advise various leaders. So if a king's going to make a decision, he'll ask the prophet what God thinks. They enact change. These prophets are trying to make the worlds they live in better. They perform symbolic acts. Isaiah goes around naked for a couple years. Jeremiah is going to build a yoke. They're going to do symbolic acts. They're even going to name their kids silly names sometimes to get a point across. And then they also declare oracles. So basically people in the ancient Near East are very superstitious, and they believe special people who have a special connection to deities can both figure out what's destined to happen, but they can also intervene to change those destinies. It's a pretty valuable tool. We have several interesting sets of ancient texts that show us prophets worked long before there was a Hebrew Bible. So long before Moses, there were prophets, and they worked for deities other than Yahweh. One great example of this comes from a city in modern-day Syria known as Mari. Here we see some mud bricks from Mari at a gate, and then we have the statue fertility goddess. What I love about this statue is that it's drilled out, so they would pump water through her. There's a hole at the bottom of her feet, and it would come out the vase that she's holding between her arms. So it's sort of like a magic trick that they would say the god is manifest in the statue, and to prove it, they'd have that miracle, allegedly, where the water would come out of the vase. Here we see Mari, right on the Euphrates River in the eastern section of what would the modern country of Syria. They had, I think, 25,000 tablets written in Akkadian from the time of Zimri Lim, which is around 1750 BCE. These 25,000 tablets were discovered. They were excavated in the 1930s by a French team, but the time in which these letters are written, 1750 BCE, that's the time of that Hammurabi of the famous law code, that he was ruling in Babylon. And incidentally, Hammurabi would lead an army that would destroy Mari, and that would leave the tablets untouched until they were discovered in the 1930s. So here's one of the letters from Mari. It's interesting that they're collecting these prophetic texts, but here's what the letter says. Speak to my Lord, thus Nursin your servant. Abiah, prophet of Adad, the Lord of Aleppo, came to me and said, Thus says Adad, I have given the whole country to Yakhdun Lim. Thanks to my weapons, he did not meet his equal. He, however, abandoned my cause. So I gave to Shamshi Adad the land I had given to him. I want to restore you. I restored the throne of your father's house. I anointed you with the oil of my luminosity. Now hear a single word of mine. If anyone cries out to you for judgment, saying, I have been wronged, be there to decide his case. Answer him fairly. This is what I desire of you. If you go off to war, never do so without consulting an oracle. When I become manifest in my oracle, go to the war. If it does not happen, do not go out of the city gate. This is what the prophet said to me. Now I have sent the hair of the prophet and a fringe of his garment to my Lord. All right, so there's a lot of things going on here. We have the god Adad telling the prophet Abiah, who then tells Nursin the servant, who tells the king. And basically, Adad is reminding him that he put somebody into power, he took it away. He wants the king to not just be powerful, but to judge things fairly. And also, the deity certainly wants to be in the loop, right? He's telling the king, don't do anything without checking with me. Then, what's interesting about the Mari letters is to verify that a prophet really said it, they send along a hair from the prophet and the fringe of his garment to verify it. Sounds kind of crazy, but interesting. All right, then about 1,000 years after Mari, we have the people in Assyria also writing letters that involve prophecy. Here we see a letter from the Assyrian king Sargon, written in cuneiform, which means wedge-shaped writings, as we see here. All right, so if we see Mari on the Euphrates River, Nineveh is a major city in the Assyrian Empire. It's on the Tigris River up north. And here's one of the letters. Esarhaddon, king of the lands, fear not. What is the wind that has attacked you, whose wings I have not broken? Like ripe apples your enemies will continually roll before your feet. I am the great lady. I am Ishtar of Arbela, who throw your enemies before your feet. Have I spoken to you any words that you cannot rely upon? I am Ishtar of Arbela. I will flay your enemies and deliver them up before you. I am Ishtar of Arbela. I go before you and behind you. Fear not, you have got cramps. But I, in the midst of wailing, will get up and sit down by the mouth of Isar-la-Tashiat, a man from Arbela. So the goddess Ishtar, this particular manifestation of her is from the city of Arbela, and Ishtar is telling the prophet, who then writes to the king. And it's to remind the king that she's trustworthy and she's a good friend to have. All right, no hair or a fringe of the garment here. And here we see a picture of the Sumerian deity Inanna, which in Akkadian is Ishtar. See the horns on her head? Deities often are depicted showing horns. She's often affiliated with lions, right, that we see her standing on. And she's got bird feet here. All right, so that's Ishtar. And prophecy is not limited to Mesopotamia. In Egypt, we have a famous story called Wen Ammon, or Ben Ammon. It's a story about an Egyptian official who sails to Lebanon to get some wood to build a large ship for the deity Ammon. But he gets robbed, and then he robs some other people as a payback, and he finds himself in all sorts of trouble. And sadly, too, the text breaks off when I think he's on the island, and he's on an island trying to get home. It's complicated, but while Wen Ammon is at Byblos, a major city in Phoenicia or modern Lebanon, the story says that a noble youth of Byblos gets possessed by a deity, and he goes into a frenzy. While this young kid is possessed and speaking on behalf of the god who took over his body, then Ammon uses that opportunity to get the heck out of Byblos. So the idea is the prophet inhabits a body and you go into a frenzy. Another way to say that is ecstatic, right? It's not happy, like some people would say he's ecstatic today, but it's more in line with a medical designation of ecstatic, which is a trance state, accompanied by a loss of sense perception and voluntary control. I think of the movie in 1973, The Exorcist, where some archaeologists excavated the statue to the left. It's a deity that lives in the desert named Pazuzu. And in the movie, Pazuzu then inhabited the body of this 12-year-old girl. And so she wasn't herself anymore, it was the deity and speaking through her. That's kind of what they believed about ancient prophecy, that if I was going to prophecy for a deity, I wouldn't be myself anymore, the deity would be speaking through my body. And by the way, I've excavated several sites in Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, and I've never seen anything like this happen when we dig up statues. All right, sun gods are most often affiliated with prophecy and with justice. Here we see Hammurabi's law code from the time of the Mari letters we looked at earlier, around 1750 BCE. Here Hammurabi is standing to the left, and he's getting the law code from the deity on the right. See the horns on the head. And that deity is Shamash, the sun deity. So they're here, it's because they're in charge of laws, but they're also in charge of prophecy. This is most famously exemplified with Greek mythology, where Apollo is the sun god and the god of prophecy, where he will get various prophets like Tiresias and Cassandra to be able to see the future. So sun gods shed light on dark situations. So that's why the sun deity. Here you see in the shoulders these flames shooting out of the sun deity. All right, so Moses is perhaps the most famous prophet in the Hebrew Bible. Well, let me get rid of the perhaps. He is the most famous prophet in the Hebrew Bible. Several authors of the Torah certainly think he was the greatest. From Moses, we learn that you can't predict who God is going to choose to deliver his message. Moses was a murderer before God picked him. Also, we see a common theme with Moses, that being a prophet is a very hard task. Moses tries to get out of the job repeatedly when God commissions him. Moses is caught in the middle of a fight between God and the people of Israel. One time when Moses is talking to God, he gets so close to him that something happens to change Moses, where he says he did not know that the skin of his face, we have a Hebrew word karan, which might mean horns. Here we see a statue of Moses with horns on it from that passage, but it might also mean some kind of bumps on his skin, because he's got to wear a veil after that. But anyway, being a prophet is hard. You're an intermediary between God and the people. There are times that God wants to destroy Israel, and Moses, as the intermediary, has to talk God out of it. Then there are times when the Israelites have had it with God, and they want him to go away. Moses has to convince them to stick with Yahweh. At one point in Numbers 11, Moses asked God to kill him. And they never show this drama in the movies, right? But why does Moses ask God to kill him? Well, he's had enough. Here's what Numbers 11 says. Let's read it. Moses heard the people of every family wailing at the entrance to their tents. The Lord became exceedingly angry. I should point out the reason these people are complaining is they don't have the food they want to eat. And they're in a desert. And the Lord became exceedingly angry, and Moses was troubled. He asked the Lord, "Why have you brought this trouble on your servant? What have I done to displease you that you put the burden of all these people on me? Did I conceive all these people? Did I give them birth? Why do you tell me to carry them in my arms, as a nurse carries an infant, to the land you promised on oath, to their ancestors? Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, 'Give us meat to eat.' I cannot carry these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. If this is how you're going to treat me, please go ahead and kill me, if I have found favor in your eyes, and do not let me face my own ruin." All right, so that's a heck of a way to speak to Yahweh, and also it shows that Moses is having a hard time being an intermediary. He's upset with God, he's upset with the people. He asks God just to kill him and get it over with because he can't deal with this burden. God's answer is to tell Moses to delegate, so he's going to appoint some people to handle some of the smaller details. All right, well, if we get a little bit of, after Moses, we read about several other prophets in the Bible. Some of the most famous are going to show up in the former prophets that we talked about earlier when they're talking about the monarchy. Because it seems that every king has a prophet who sort of serves as a checks and balance system. Saul's prophet is Samuel, and they fight quite a bit, right? Samuel anoints Saul the first king, but then there are going to be problems when Saul does things to upset Samuel. David is the king, and he has Nathan as his prophet. They fight quite a bit as well, and Nathan is the one who tells David that God knows what he did, or he knows that he slept with Bathsheba and killed Uriah the Hittite. Then later in the 9th century, we get famous prophets like Elijah and Elisha, who run around doing miracles like some sort of a shamanistic priest. Elisha even curses some kids who teased him because he was bald, and then some bears ate the kids. What a wonderful story. Anyway, these early prophets are predecessors for the main topic of prophets in the Hebrew Bible, which start out with what we call the classic prophets, or the 8th century prophets: Amos, Micah, Hosea, and Isaiah. Right, so 8th century. So I should point out 8th century BCE includes the date 750, right? You should kind of count backwards. But you notice how these are all grouped or clustered. We don't have prophetic activity that we read about in the Bible from 800 to 750. It's just because those are fairly peaceful times, as we'll look at later on in other lectures. But when times are troubling, we get more prophetic activity. So the 8th century prophets, Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah, they all seem to be in response to the rise of Assyria, and Assyria destroying the nation of Israel around 722 BCE and coming close to destroying Judah. All right, then around 650 to 600 BCE, we get another cluster of prophets. And they're in response to the decline of Assyria, and they're afraid of Babylon getting more powerful. Then we see Zephaniah, Habakkuk, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Nahum, and also you might put Ezekiel in the second part too. But after 6th century prophets, we get Isaiah chapters 40 through 66. When we get to the Isaiah lecture, I'll talk a little bit about how scholars divide Isaiah up into 1st Isaiah, which is the 8th century prophet, chapters 1 through 39, and then 2nd and or 3rd Isaiah, chapters 40 through 66. The key point here is these are all exilic prophets or post-exilic prophets. The exile refers to Judah being taken to Babylon in captivity from 586 BCE until the end of the exile, when Babylon's destroyed by Persia in 539, and a year later when Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, lets the Judeans return home. So these, if we have to look at historical context for why these authors are writing, these people are trying to give hope to people in Babylon, and they're trying to have a lot of hope that Persia is going to be a benevolent ruler with their empire. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about inductive divinizing and intuitive divinizing, and look at the difference. So with inductive, it's a direct study of concrete objects with the goal of obtaining divinely revealed knowledge. So some examples of this, well, almost 30% of the tablets that they found at Nineveh, that Assyrian city that we read earlier, about 30% of them have to do with this. People were reading livers. They were putting oil on water to look at the patterns. They would look at smoke and the way it went up in patterns. They would look at birds in flight, looking for signs. Dreams are a very important part of prophecy. Stellar events like an eclipse, they would try to see that as a sign from the deity. They would cast dice called lots. Today we have tarot card readers, palm readers that do the same sort of thing, believing there's signs for people to do this. Again, they're very superstitious. They believe that with proper training and gifts, certain people are able to see these things and find out what it means. All right. Then that's inductive, but with intuitive, this is where gods take the initiative and speak through intuitions of chosen messengers. And as we said before, it's modeled on how royal messengers delivered messages. Thus says King Ramses, I have ordered you to obey me, for example. And for Israel, the intuitive was much more common, where a prophet would show up and claim to have a message from Yahweh. The problem is sometimes another prophet would say, well, Yahweh told me the opposite. In the Bible, there's a law that says you can tell if a prophet is a true prophet or a false prophet. You can tell if they're a true prophet because what they predict comes true. So that doesn't really help us a whole lot. All right, but they did have inductive divination all the same. They had what's called Urim and Tumim. These were sacred dice that the high priest kept in his breastplate, and he could ask a yes or no answer, throw the dice, and get it answered. But intuitive is the Hebrew word prophet, one who is called. Right? That's where God's going to speak on their behalf. And again, modeled on the institution of a royal messenger. Here is a picture I took at a model tabernacle some time ago. This is a picture of somebody dressed up as the high priest. And you see that thing, I do have an arrow, right there. Oh, there goes the arrow. But that's called the breastplate. And you notice he's got 12 stones on there inscribed. Each one of them is for a tribe of Israel. And behind the breastplate, that's where he keeps the Urim and Tumim, these sacred dice. And Urim is a yes answer. It means, it's the word for light, like light shines on it and it's chosen. Tumim means innocent. Job, for example, is called an Ish Tumim, or an innocent man. All right, so if you get 2 Urim, that's a yes answer. If you get 2 Tumim, that's a no answer. And half the time, actually, you're going to get no answer at all. It's like the 8-ball saying, ask again later, it's unclear. So 50% of the time you get that, 25% you get yes, 25% no. Incidentally, we have dice from the ancient world that were weighted so they could get the answer they wanted. Right? Still, people are always cheating. All right, this image is used as a banner in a course I teach on prophets and prophecy. We see a sheep's liver labeled to show how to read it. And if there's a blemish in a certain area, they would look to this museum. I think it's now in the British Museum, but they would look to the this clay liver model to find out what was going on. What does that say? Liver. All right, again, a clay liver model of a sheep's liver. And to the right, where you see prophets and prophecy, and then in the circles with white, you see words for God, words for prophets from the Hebrew Bible. Navi, Ish Elohim, Roeh, and Jose. We've looked at those earlier. Here's a better picture of sheep's model, or sheep's liver model. And you see in each one of those squares, they have writing saying, if you find a blemish in this area, here's what it means. All right, a few more points. Prophets were not the authors of the books that bear their names. Jeremiah did not write Jeremiah. Isaiah did not write Isaiah. But what we do when we study the prophets is we're going to study the author, and we're going to look at the context in which the prophet lived. Like when we look at Amos, we're going to look at why did he go to Israel and make his prophecy? What was the context behind it? We'll look at his life. But when we can, we'll also study the editorial process that gave rise to the book as we know it. This is going to be the most clear when we get to Jeremiah, where we have a lot of information about his scribe and the process. All right, these prophetic books, too, are not just simple stories, one author from beginning to end with a narration. They're anthologies. They have all sorts of literary pieces. They have poems, they have doxologies, they have narrative stories. Sometimes they switch from first to third person. Anyway, lots of different literary pieces. And so that's it for the introduction to prophets and prophecy. And if you're interested, I'd recommend that you look at the video about one of my favorite prophets, Amos, next. He's the 8th century prophet and started the ball rolling for this. Thanks.